This is a pre-recorded lecture. Unfortunately, the speaker had a personal emergency and could not be with us today. But I highly recommend this lecture, which is called "The Importance of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Games Industry," presented by Jay Uppal from Newzoo.
Hi there. Thanks for joining this talk. In this session, I'm going to be looking at the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the games industry. I'm mainly looking at the results of a recent survey that we did on the topic here at Newzoo, but also bringing key metrics from the industry, as well as looking at some of the examples of DEI in games and the varying level of success that they've found. Before that, quickly, I'm Jay Uppal. I'm the game development and publishing consultant here at Newzoo. Prior to that, I also used to work at a small indie called Payload Studios as their data and marketing lead, and then also as a UA manager before that for mobile games. Quick word on Newzoo before we dive straight into the results. So Newzoo is a games market intelligence and analytics company. We offer a range of products that look into the games industry and the key metrics around it from our platform, the Newzoo Expert platform, which offers dashboards and other sort of key metrics around primarily PC and console games, as well as mobile, but our key focus is the PC and console side. There we have everything from revenue data to MAUs and other key metrics that can help with benchmarking and analysis of games and genres and looking at different territory around the world. We also include sort of viewership and engagement data there as well. On the other side is our consumer insights product. This is where we do an annual research survey every year, looking at some of the key trends in the game space from a consumer side, especially looking at things like key personas and sort of demographics and behavior of people that play the games of these games, essentially. And finally, consulting, which is where I sit, which marries sort of all of our solutions to offer sort of strategic and financial advice to companies of all sizes and shapes and from various industries, both inside games and externally. For instance, anyone looking to invest in games or understand the industry, then also from developers and publishers who are looking to bring their games to market and looking to do anything from, for instance, a concept test or concept greenlighting, where they want to understand, what the market size would be and what the challenges of, putting a new game out there with certain monetization aspects would be, for instance. So really looking at those strategic and financial decision makers who want to gain more insights into the industry and where they're headed. Now, diving straight in, it wouldn't be a Newzoo presentation if we didn't have some numbers. So straight off the bat, here we go. Just last year, the games industry was actually worth over 192.7 billion USD in revenues. Now that's just crazy. This year we're actually going to pass the 200 billion mark, and then by 2024 we're expected to go up to roughly just over 220 billion. To put that 192 into context from last year, that's actually bigger than both the music and film industries combined in the last year. And that's just astonishing to see, because games is by far the youngest in the overall of these industries. So seeing it sort of overtake these traditional entertainment mediums is just insane, and it's not looking to stop growing, as you've seen, especially as big streamers and things come into play, with Netflix coming into games. That number is going to significantly expand over the next coming years. Now, when we look at the number, the 203 billion revenues by region split here, you can see that roughly half of that revenue actually comes from the Asia Pacific region, with just over a quarter coming in from North America. The other regions of the world make up roughly the remaining 25%, the remaining quarter. But one thing to note is that both Latin America and Middle East and Africa are among the fastest growing spaces in terms of revenues. But yeah, overall, we can still see that almost half the revenues are literally driven by both just China and the US, making them by far the key, most important global markets in terms of revenues. Now, if we take another view of this by the people behind those numbers, so the actual gamers, we see that just over half of these actually come from the Asia Pacific region, with that almost a quarter of those revenues from North America coming just from that 7%, that really small chunk in North America. So while North America has the smallest player base of any of these regions, it actually accounts for the most revenue, making one of the most valuable regions. The Asia Pacific's almost kind of 1-on-1 in terms of the revenue versus the players. We can see again, Europe's also along the 1-on-1 line, whereas Middle East and Africa and Latin America have significantly more population than they do contribute to revenues, but they are again the fastest growing both in terms of player base and revenue growth. So another kind of key market to keep an eye on. But yeah, it's really crazy to see that almost 40% of the world's population would essentially have in some way interacted with games or played a game this year. And that just goes to show, how important it is to recognize how diverse games has become and how global it's become in terms of the reach that any game has the potential to have these days. So jumping into some of the key metrics from our DEI study. This study was conducted in the UK and the US with just over 1,500 respondents in each. It was asked to a wide range of people. So as you can see, that there's a gender split here of roughly 55, 54 to 46 in both regions. And then also the varying kind of income levels there. And of course, what kind of, and where these people kind of lie within the DEI spectrum. I think we had roughly half people did not belong to any of these minorities. But you can see here that we do have a range of roughly a third who identify as having disabilities, and then 15% coming from ethnic minorities, and also from roughly the LGBTQA plus demographic as well. Now, before we sort of dive straight into these survey results that we're going to be looking into, I just wanted to kind of highlight one key metric that I think is pretty important, and one that definitely goes against a lot of the stereotypes that we've had in the past and are slowly breaking down, but I think it's important to recognize. And that's that roughly half of the world's gamers are actually women. Like this year, we actually have a split of 51-49 versus male-female players. Of course, this isn't equal across all platforms. I think if we look at PC console, that split's actually much more skewed towards males, whereas looking at mobile side, females are kind of more even there. And that's really what's driven up this number is the mobile game representation. So that's something to note. But that, even on PC console, that number is starting to equalize a lot more than it has in the past. So I think it's important to note for everyone that, women gamers, female gamers do exist. They are out there, and they are becoming more and more prominent. And so, the old stereotype of, games are just for boys or men just doesn't exist anymore. But on the flip side, we actually asked gamers, how they felt about being represented in games, and if they had a sense of belonging in games. We can quite clearly see that by gender here, there is still a big divide where, the male demographic definitely is better represented and has more of a sense of belonging in games against the female demographic. And I think part of that just comes from, the industry. It has been a very male-heavy industry in the past, and when we're looking at kind of the games that we produce, they've definitely at times been male orientated, and that sometimes does filter into communities, especially when we're trying to engage with women. And you can see that statistic here, while we've definitely kind of closed the gap a lot, that divide still exists, and it's still something that I think everyone should be aware of, that female players do exist, and they may not be as well represented or be able to belong into these game communities, which is one of the core aspects of why anyone plays a game. So just to keep that in mind going forward. But looking beyond just gender, this is actually a problem kind of throughout. I think when we're looking at game communities specifically, roughly a third of gamers who we asked in the survey said that they did not necessarily feel welcome in game communities. And I mean, we know that there's been a problem with that in the big games like League of Legends, which has been known for its toxicity, especially for long-running games with new players coming in aren't always welcome. But more specifically, when we're actually looking at ethnic minorities or at LGBTQ, that third actually rises even more. So in those communities, we're looking at roughly between 40 to 50% of gamers not feeling welcome and not feeling a sense of belonging in these communities. So you can see that there's still definitely quite a bit of work to do in terms of opening up these communities, opening up these games to people of all sort of ethnic backgrounds, disability representation, and genders as well. And just looking at some top line metrics behind all of this to kind of give a bit more context. this is looking at the top 10 games in the last few years, top selling games. And what we see here is that still, almost 3/4 of these games have preset main characters that are male. 2/3 of the characters in the game in general are male, and just over 60% of characters are generally white in these games. That kind of goes to show that while, and this is a significant improvement in the last decade, I might say, but it still goes to show that there is a lot of room for this topic to be explored further, especially when we're looking at kind of mainstream and bigger titles, especially when we're looking at demographic of applying to the West, applying to US especially. There's definitely space for expanding on all of these things. Another factor that I think often gets overlooked when we're especially looking at the inclusion side is sort of the older generations. As you know, the world population is growing. More and more people, more and more gamers as well are growing with them. So we're looking here specifically at the baby boomer population, which we've defined as people between the age of 56 and 65 in our survey. And you can see that, just over 40% of them are actually gamers or play video games, I should say. And just over half of these are actually women, with, again, engaging mostly on mobile, and then followed by PC and console lagging behind that. And they spend a fair amount of time playing games, with a third of them even spending money in games. And looking just beyond this as well, my grandma, for instance, she's in her 80s now, and I would definitely say she's also a gamer. She spends most of her time these days just playing on tablet and mobile games, the vast majority of time. I can tell you when I was visiting her in January, it was harder to get her to spend time with me than to see her just playing the day away, essentially. And she was really excited about gaming technologies. I took my Oculus to her, and she played in the VR world for the first time, and she really loved it. So that just goes to show that games is all spanning both within culture, mediums, looking across genders, but then also across age groups. Especially as we're getting older and entertainment is becoming more interactive, games is going to be one of the main things that the old generation looks at. So that's another demographic that's highly underrepresented in games, and not one that most people often target for either. But when we're looking at some of the key aspects behind what factors into people buying games, it's not always going to be the DEI elements that are the key aspects, even from this survey group that we had. It was usually affordability in the game reception. So, even if you do incorporate DEI elements into your game and make it accessible to more people, it'll definitely be able to be played by more people and reached by more people. But ultimately, if your game is not affordable by these people, especially when we're looking around the globe, if it's not price normalized for a local region, or if this game is not well designed, not well made, then you're still not going to necessarily make up. People are not going to buy your game just because of the DEI elements incorporated in it. So while I think it's definitely important, that's not sort of the be-all end-all of a game. The game must still be a good game, it must be playable, it must be accessible to these people and affordable. And those are some of the key aspects that we can highlight from the survey that we've taken here as well. But then diving more into the DEI aspects and what was of most important for gamers when we're looking at DEI specifically, the two ones that really stuck out here for me and for the people who responded were that these game communities should be welcoming. So I think we all recognize how big the social and community focus behind a game is these days, especially if we're looking at live game. And so being felt welcome, being felt included, and being felt like this game is made for you, that audience respects you and can kind of engage with you, is of key importance to all kinds of gamers, I think. And the second one being the value and ethics of a company. I think we've seen a lot of scandals in the games industry in the past few years around work culture, diversity, representation, but then also just bad work ethic in terms of crunch. And gamers recognize this. Gamers do like to see that the companies that they're going behind, that they're funding, are ones that they can support, that are supporting good deeds out there. And often, any company that engages in DEI or looks towards highlighting the issues, bringing them forward, and really improving on them, is one that wins over a lot of gamers and a lot of attention from the industry, just for making those moves in the first place and being transparent to the gamers, of course. Looking kind of on the flip side in terms of representation in the industry specifically, so this is taken from the IGDA survey, which they've conducted over the last few years from 2017 to last year. And we can definitely see that there is improvement being made here. So, from 2017 to 21, we've seen that, it's gone from roughly 3/4 of the people working in the industry, game developers being men, to now just 60%. So equalizing on the gender ratio there. Is still definitely more orientated by, the white Caucasian European demographic, as we can see there, rather than the Asian demographic as much. Of course, this is looking at the US. Majority of respondents are from there, so it is going to be a bit more skewed than, if we were looking at Asia, we would have completely different representation, for instance. We can also see that in terms of sex, straight people, in terms of the representation in the game developer communities, that proportion is also equalizing a bit more, with more LGBT people being included in the industry. And finally, the last one being the people with disabilities. I think this is the one that still needs the most improvement overall. They're still a minority in terms of being represented on a game developer scope, and that hasn't really shifted too much in the last 5 years or so. So definitely a lot of sort of movement made there. However, a lot of people have seen improvements in the games industry in the last few years, and it becoming more diverse, especially with workplaces becoming more diverse. And I think, this is also reflected in a result that we had from the GDC State of the Games Industry Survey for 2021, where we see that about 60% of game devs actually said that in the last year, their studio had focused on DEI initiatives, and in large part been successful. As you can see from the right here, we can see that roughly 72% of developers said that studio attempts to make for DEI initiatives have been successful and have been well received, and really grown their staff. You can see the example here being Rocksteady. But one of the key sort of issues that still exists here is that while DEI is becoming more prominent in the industry and just the world in general, it's not necessarily as reflected, especially at the management level, especially when we're looking at the upper levels. And that's not just a games industry problem, that's wider, just general problem in the world, where I think minorities, diverse groups are not really at the top levels. Often they'll be relegated to diversity hires just for the sake of it. And I think that's definitely something that, while it has improved significantly, is something that we still need to keep in mind and take a look around. Is everyone in a management position, is everyone in a senior position essentially like white male or men? Then you can see quite clearly that there is still work to be done there. But yeah, I'm happy to say that this is still an issue that's been looked at and is slowly improving. We are definitely, by shining a spotlight on this, improving the representation in the upper management levels as well. Now, looking at some of the sort of key reasons of why DEI aspects are important, why, especially for a company to look into, half of the player populations that we actually asked this survey about said that they would be more likely to play games from companies that focus on DEI elements, and specifically are looking at incorporating them into the company. So even far beyond just games, people do like to see that these companies are representative and do have sort of a wider voice that they can look into and get inspiration from other games as well. Now, shifting gears slightly, we're going to be looking at some of the examples of DEI initiatives games, where we've come to some of the sort of challenges there, but then also the innovations and the success stories behind it. So starting off the bat, accessibility in AAA games. So this has been sort of a big focal topic, and of course, not everyone has the money and the resources to invest in DEI, and it is definitely important to have a good and successful game, and you should never be shoehorning diversity inclusion elements into a game just for the sake of it. But it's heartening to see, especially on the bigger studios, investing so deeply into DEI elements. And there, a couple of key examples from recent years of games that really pushed the boundaries here come from The Last of Us 2, which actually featured over 60 accessibility settings. And that's not just for, ethnic minorities or disabled gamers, but it also goes to every single gamer out there, that they had an option to change the way that they could play and really orientate the game to themselves, even if you don't necessarily say that you belong to one of these DEI communities, diverse communities. is something that was beneficial for everyone. From being able to color change things for low vision and blind players to just be able to adjust every little setting to your liking as a gamer. And the Naughty Dog was actually awarded with the inaugural um, Innovation Accessibility Award by the Gaming Magazine Group, just showing how much they actually pushed for this. And I think everyone was pretty much knew that they were going to win that award that year. But what's cool is that other studios have actually sort of picked up that mantle, with Playground Games actually taking inspiration from The Last of Us specifically in terms of accessibility and really trying to up that level, adding sign language support into the game cutscenes. Again, this is going to be quite costly and not something that everyone can manage. But there are a lot of resources out there, especially from studios like these, from Naughty Dog, from Playground Games, that are, working with other, companies like PlayStation, like Xbox, to really put out the diversity tools, put out the accessibility tools that they have built for these games, and make them more accessible to the industry as a whole. So there's a lot more resource out there from these bigger games companies and studios, filtering down and being made more accessible to the wider audience, wider dev communities as well. So it's definitely one thing to look into if you're interested in looking at expanding, the accessibility elements within your game. Looking more into, the characters behind the games, looking at, a bit more in terms of representation here. So we've seen, especially in the last few years, and this is more true, I think, in narrative games, especially that we're seeing, is that there have been now, like trans characters in leading roles. So Tell Me Why, a narrative-driven game, was applauded for portraying the main character as a trans character in a very sort of respectful way, really owning to what these communities feel like going into really the in essence of what it feels like to belong to that community, and all the sort of doubt that goes with that. And they presented that in a very, very well way, and like I think it was very well respected and founded by all communities, not just the LGBT community alone. Just in terms of opening the eyes of people to these challenges that these people face. We're seeing a lot more queer representation in games. Again, Last of Us 2, the main protagonist Ellie was openly gay, and the game, I mean, it was a very heavy-hitting game that went very deeply into my questions of morality, but it did look specifically at transphobia and homophobia elements. And a lot of the supporting cast also was looking at these LGBT elements in society and how they're not always accepted, and bringing some of those prejudices to the foreground. Finally, as mentioned here, we're seeing things like the gaming magazine pop up, which really spotlights games that look to incorporate things like LGBTQIA elements into their games. And they've also had now, I think, 2 or 3 game awards looking specifically at representation. And this year, Life is Strange: True Colors actually won big, winning both, or actually 3 awards. So Game of the Year, Best LGBT Character, and also Most Authentic Representation, with the lead character here being Alex Chen, just up there. Really providing kind of an insight into the Asian American journey, and showing quite a diverse small town in the States itself, just showing that it has become quite diverse, and allowing players to sort of choose the path. I think they handled LGBT really well in this game, in that the player themselves could choose to go down that route, or could just play going down, making their character straight or making them openly gay if they wanted to. So just allowing that option and allowing people to sort of choose their own journey and experience in that way, I think that freedom really respects and is a great way of including these elements into a game, and allowing people to experience it in the way that they want, rather than it being sort of forced into them, which is one of the key things where we see DI elements fail, is when it almost feels like it's shoehorned just for the sake of it, rather than being there authentically and being there to actually represent the experiences of these people and these communities. I think it's always worth noting that if you try and force it, it's never going to be accepted or even done well, and that's going to come across by the player feedback that you're going to see there. So it's better not to force it in, or even have it at all, if you haven't properly sort of done the research and executed it in a meaningful and respectful way that will engage with the player audiences out there. looking at sort of a different trend now. So where we're going to look here, where kind of DEI elements or looking to expand a profile have failed in the past, and why that might be. And this really comes about, I think, one of the clear examples in the last few years was through Creative Assembly's Total War franchise. It's a strategy-based game, and they've had a lot of different games there, from Total War Warhammer, Total War Rome, and Total War Three Kingdoms, which is the one we're going to focus on here. Now, the Total War franchise is a strategic-based game, which is very big in China. CA is a British developer, but they had quite a big player base in China for producing these strategy-based games. So in 2019, they launched this game called Total War Three Kingdoms, which specifically reached out to the Chinese audience, where The Legend of the Three Kingdoms is quite popular. And there's been a lot of games, a lot of media around that era specifically. Initially it was very successful for them when they launched this game. I think they sold over 1 million units within their first week. It's one of the top 20 best launches on Steam as of 2019. And within the first weekend, they had over 190,000 concurrent players, which is nothing to laugh about. And most of this was driven by China. All its popularity was driven by China. And to their credit, CA did a lot right here. In terms of localization, in terms of the design, the art of the world, the gameplay. While it was definitely very buggy at the beginning, that was one of the key issues with it. It tried to respect the culture to a vast degree. Where they failed, however, was in actually understanding the era of the Three Kingdoms that they were looking to build their game around, and how Chinese players expect to encounter that. So we're looking at more of like a cultural sense here, is where they seem to have really fallen short. And that's because the game itself was actually set as a prequel to the Three Kingdoms era, without actually being mentioned in the marketing of it itself. So when Chinese players started playing it, they were a little bit disappointed. They still went in, and they were still excited that the game would progress towards the Three Kingdoms era that they know and encounter in most of their stories. Being a prequel, they thought that CA has a background of developing the games for years on end. They thought that it would go into that time zone, essentially time region. Looking at the main core sort of combat in the Three Kingdoms era. But it did not. And the DLCs that CA released around this game were actually in different eras, and they did not necessarily match with what Three Kingdoms specifically was supposed to represent. And so you can see that the player base started to dwindle. And as in May last year, so this graph here is actually just looking at the last year, 2021 to 2022, January to January. And in May last year, just over 2 years after the game was initially released, CA announced that it was going to completely discontinue support for the franchise. And you can see that with a complete collapse. I think one thing to note here is actually that Eastern Asia territory there does not include China metrics here, because you can't share those at the moment. But it includes South Korea, which is another big region for this game. But yeah, you can see that this confidence, especially in the Asian regions, completely disappeared, and they completely alienated a vast amount of the player base. Was still hit in North America and Western Europe, but not completely as hard. Now, why is this bad? This not only alienated the people from the Three Kingdoms game, but it also led them to review bombing other associated games from CA. So the fact that they discontinued support for this and really let down their players, and part of that came from them not understanding the culture behind what they were really striving for in this game. That alienated player group then went on to basically review bomb Total War Warhammer 2, and we can see that by this small white star that you can see in that May 2021 era that Steam's kind of highlighted very nicely already. And to sort of rectify that, while they had alienated a large player base, there were still people that were willing to pay these games because strategy games are so well received in China. They actually built a Chinese faction in the new game, Total War Warhammer 3, which came out in February. Unfortunately, that game was not very well received because of its buggy nature because it was released as an incomplete game, and part of that was also on the Chinese faction side. Players were again very disappointed. So it's really a double whammy there, where they've let down the Chinese players once, and again the second time a few years later on. And especially when we're looking at cultural representation, I think CA isn't completely at fault here. They did look a lot at when they were developing this game to be respectful to the region, but they clearly just weren't able to match it on a cultural sense and did not understand the player base that they were reaching for. And so I think that part is very important whenever you're looking at putting diversity in a game. I mean, this game was literally built around that population, but they largely failed because they were unable to specifically get this audience, get into the mindset of this audience and understand how they actually play those games and how the games in those regions act for this specific time era. Now, on the flip side, looking at diversity where it's done well in one of the most popular games in the world, this would be Apex Legends. So we actually asked about franchise inclusivity of some of the top franchises out there in our survey, and we saw that over just over almost like 70, almost three quarters, almost 75%, so 74% roughly, of players said that Apex has moderate to very high inclusivity in the game. And this is actually reflected in sort of the top legends that are picked. So we can see, of the top 5 picks from the game, most popular legends that people play, 2 are women, with one being LGBT, 2 are men, and then the last one is actually gender neutral. So you can see just from the player base, they are not put off by the fact that these characters are diverse, and each of these characters offer something unique and have unique traits that really make them popular with their players. So I think that just goes to show that adding diversity into a game where it's not necessarily just shoehorned, it's kind of a neat extra thing, but it's done well. I think Apex does a very good job of showing that, and that's respected by a lot of its player base. And they are, very open to playing characters that are not just white male, for instance, which I think we all know, but it's worth just reiterating. Taking sort of a deeper dive into Apex, especially when we're looking at where people come from. So the top markets by multi-active users here you can see is the US, Japan, and the UK. But taking another view of it when we're looking at player share, so this is specifically looking at PC console player share. So there's a proportion of people in these regions that own PC console that play Apex. You can see that almost 40% of the people that own PC console in Japan actually play Apex. That's quite a lot of people playing Apex in Japan. And that's also reflected in the MAUs there. For it being quite a small country, it has one of the most valuable populations, and that's very inclined in playing Apex. On the other side, you've also got US and South Africa as the second and third regions by player share here. Kind of roughly 10 to 15% of people on these console PC playing Apex, which by numbers is quite a lot, and that's reflected in the MAUs numbers there for the US. And as of last month, April, this game was actually ranked number 1 by genre in MAUs and second in Japan. So ranked 1 for Battle Royale genre and MAUs in Japan, and then second after Fortnite for US and UK, I should say. And it was first in the Battle Royale genre by hours just watched on streaming. So we're seeing a lot of engagement here from content creators and streamers for this game specifically all around the world, primarily Japan and the US, which are very, very different territories. Looking now at revenues here, we're looking at revenues for console for Apex. You can see sort of it has those very spikes, and a lot of those spikes, I should reiterate, do come with content updates, and especially looking at characters. So I mean the key release dates with characters were May 21, August 21, I believe November, and then February of 22. With the 2 biggest jumps actually being in May 21 and also February 21. And these are both new female characters. The May jump specifically is quite big in that all the promotional for that was really orientated towards a Japanese theme. So they were definitely catering towards a Japanese player base. What's interesting is that the character that they released here, Valkyrie, who was actually in the top 5 picked legends played, as we saw before, is actually a Japanese American character who's also LGBTQIA. So that just goes to show, and that's not, I think that's brave of Respawn to do this, is because that's not the core demographic in Japan. That's, Japan in general has been very conservative. And so, putting a Japanese American character while I think, it definitely had certain elements there, and they did have a lot of Japanese orientated sort of side events going on in that season to attract the player base. The character specifically was made more for like an Asian American demographic, really catering to their base, US player base, but in a diverse way. And I mean, these revenues are actually the US, I should say. So as you can see, it did pay off, and we saw a quite sharp increase in both PlayStation, Xbox revenues with the introduction of this new character. And I mean, I can't say that's all just DEI thing. I think DEI is a cool element behind that, but the character this season was extremely well designed as well and very well received by the player base. And so that definitely also has an impact on seeing these kind of rises. And I think, by seeing where the other rises are, they are with content patches. You can see that definitely that is a cyclical thing, but I still think the magnitude here is quite a big change. And that sort of brings us to the end of this presentation. I definitely hope you learned something about DEI and elements of it. And I think some of the key sort of takeaways that I hope came across from this talk were that gamers are quite a diverse bunch. Roughly 40% of the population is in some way a gamer. They come in all sizes, shapes, forms, age groups, and so I think that's just important to notice whenever you're building a game. Is you should know the audience that you're building for, but also know the audience that you're not, and know that there is more people that may experience your game and can see how they will take things away from the game. Another aspect is that more women are playing games now than ever before, so I think that's very important to recognize, is that those old gender stereotypes just don't exist anymore, or should exist to a lesser degree at least. And then the third one, I think, is for me at least the most important thing, especially from a game developer perspective, is that DEI elements should never be shoehorned into the game. They should not just be there for the sake of being there. They should have a purpose, and they should be done in a respectful way. They should be something you plan from the start when you're designing the game. But I think it's also important to notice, which the next one kind of says, is that accessibility and affordability are of key importance in the game. And so, if your game is not well designed, if it's not easily accessible to people or easily accessible in different markets, people aren't going to play it. If it's not a good game, if it's not fun to play, if it's not well received, the DEI elements alone will not be the saving grace. While they're kind of a neat add-on and very well liked and can definitely improve the visibility of the game and the people that can approach it and feel connected with it, they aren't going to be the ones that people will focus on specifically when they start the game. That'll be the gameplay that really drives home the success of if your game is good and something people can engage with. The last 2 points here, I think, can speak for themselves. So gamers prefer companies and workforces that have better DEI representation in them. So studios looking to hire more inclusively and looking to bring in more diverse workforce will really help them bring in these DEI elements automatically by just hearing people with different life experiences. You can incorporate that into your game, and I think that's really powerful. For me specifically, diversity is always one of the key things I look at in a workplace. Could never work anywhere that is, where you could sort of I'd need a very diverse group of people to be around me, just from being Indian myself and then having lived in Germany, the UK, Netherlands now. So being in so many different places, I would need a diverse kind of background of people to associate with. And finally, gamers do prefer it when a company has a clear stance on social issues from DEI. They like politics a lot less, but specifically when looking at things like DEI, social issues, looking at crunch, and some of the more negative stances in the games industry, pay, for instance, gamers like it to see that the studios are doing something actively behind these. And that was my talk. I hope it was informative for you and you learned something around the DEI side. I think the fact that we're all here shows that it is of importance to us. And yeah, if you have any further questions on anything I've discussed or want to dive deeper, I think a lot of this was very surface level, so there's definitely more to converse around. Please feel free to connect. And if you want to learn more about our DEI study, want more access to some of that data, more information around it, definitely connect, and I'd love to take that conversation forward. Thank you for listening. I hope it helped.